Hey everyone, Kavemi here with another Reddit story. Today's is a story that truly defies logic, about how my little nephew's unbelievable medical recovery changed everything I thought I knew about science and belief. It's a story that involves a frightening coma, a shocking awakening, and a message delivered by a tall man with kind eyes. Settle in, enjoy the Minecraft in the background, and let's get into it. The title is The Tall Man with Kind Eyes. What my nephew said after waking from a coma made me question everything. I didn't subscribe to any faith until my 3-year-old nephew awoke from a deep coma and described encountering a tall gentleman with gentle eyes. I found myself standing in the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit, PICU, at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, a day that had already stretched into the kind of perpetual nightmare that forces you to challenge every notion you hold about the operation of the universe. I was observing my 3-year-old nephew, Ben, battling for his life after a vehicle collision that should have relegated him to the tragic statistics compiled in safety manuals. The lead neurosurgeon, Dr. Adams, a man whose composure suggested he had witnessed every conceivable medical outcome and who possessed the professional detachment that accompanies the daily delivery of devastating news, had just concluded what I now recognise as the talk. You know the one. Meticulously chosen words, calculated silences and phrases like, "We've exhausted all options and it's time to prepare yourselves." It was delivered with the careful softness of someone who has conducted this conversation more times than is justifiable. My sister Chloe hadn't budged from Ben's bedside in 4 days, existing in that peculiar, unstable state between hope and sheer desperation, known only to parents of critically ill children. She was sustaining herself on hospital vending machine coffee, the flavour of which suggested it was brewed in anguish and filtered through shattered aspirations, and the occasional nutritional bar pressed into her hand by well-meaning family. Chloe has always been our family's optimist, the one who spots silver linings in storms and genuinely believes that positive thinking can influence reality. Yet, even her persistent cheerfulness had been worn down to a fragile whisper by the monotonous beeping of machines and the steady stream of healthcare professionals speaking in low, cautious tones. My brother-in-law David had developed what I privately termed the ICU circuit, a specific movement pattern involving traversing the entire hallway exactly 17 times before returning to Ben's room to gaze at his son's still form for precisely 3 minutes, then restarting the sequence with the robotic accuracy of a person creating rituals to prevent total psychological breakdown. David is an architect by trade, a man who resolves issues through logic and structured analysis. Watching him attempt to apply a troubleshooting methodology to a medical crisis that defied all logical solutions was nearly as heart-wrenching as watching Ben's tiny chest rise and fall via mechanical assistance. I am supposed to be the family's rational mind, the one with the biology degree from a respected institution and enough advanced study in cognitive science to translate medical terminology into plain language. I am the designated skeptic, the one who explains away supposed miracles using sound scientific rationale and statistical data, the one who dismisses prayer chains and gentle suggestions about trusting a higher power. But after 96 hours of watching machinery breathe for a toddler who had only just mastered the intricate skill of riding his bright blue scooter around the sidewalk, my meticulously constructed rationalism felt as effective as a cookbook in a fire. The PICU maintains its own unique acoustic environment, the predictable whoosh-whoosh of the ventilators, the irregular chirping of monitors, the quiet slide of nurses' footwear on the linoleum, and beneath it all, the persistent hum of life support systems operating tirelessly. There is also the specific odour, a blend of antiseptic cleaner, nervous perspiration, and the faint memory of whatever passes for nourishment in the facility's cafeteria. After 4 days, this sensory mix had become the soundtrack to my restless sleep, the atmospheric score to a vigil none of us ever expected to keep. Ben himself appeared impossibly small in the large hospital bed, enveloped by gear that seemed designed for someone 10 times his size. His head was swathed in bandages, giving him the look of a tiny, tragic movie mummy, and he was connected to more wires and tubes than a small satellite. Every few moments, one of the monitors would emit a different tone or alert, and we all had developed a Pavlovian response to these electronic notifications. Chloe would reach for his hand. David would halt his pacing to stare at the readings, and I would hold my breath while mentally reviewing every potential interpretation of the fluctuating numbers and flashing lights. The medical team had maintained a cautious optimism in that distinct medical way that manages to sound both hopeful and foreboding at the same time. Dr. Adams spoke in precise percentages and qualified statements, using terms like extensive cranial trauma and we are monitoring for neurological changes, all while maintaining a professional composure that must require years of rigorous training to perfect. The nurses, bless their hearts, were more direct in their compassion, providing Chloe with pillows without being asked, keeping David supplied with decent coffee from the staff lounge, and checking on Ben with the gentle efficiency acquired from years of caring for patients who cannot communicate their needs. Wednesday morning arrived with the subtle cruelty of normal time progressing, despite the suspended animation of our family crisis. Dr. Adams had scheduled what he delicately called a family consultation for 8 a.m, and we all knew this was a medical euphemism for time to discuss end-of-life decisions. Chloe had been anticipating this conversation with the singular dread of someone who knows precisely what is coming, but refuses to acknowledge it, while David had been researching experimental therapies and alternative medical opinions with the frantic thoroughness of a man trying to solve an intractable problem through sheer willpower and internet searches. At 4:23 a.m, exactly 37 minutes before the staff change, and 3 hours and 37 minutes before we were scheduled to start discussing DNR orders and organ donation, Ben opened his eyes. Not the slow, movie-like gradual awakening, not the confused blinking of someone emerging from anesthesia, but the immediate sharp awareness of a child who has just concluded a completely normal nap and is ready to resume his schedule. He sat straight up in that hospital bed with the casual assurance of someone getting out of their own bed, surveyed the room with inquisitive interest, and in a voice that was clear, strong, and had been silent for nearly a week, he asked, "Aunt Sarah, where is my stuffed gorilla?" I'd promised him we would finish our tower building game before morning mealtime. I stood there experiencing what I imagine it feels like to witness spontaneous human combustion, watching my nephew, who was literally dying 5 minutes prior, now engaging in perfectly typical 3-year-old conversation, while surrounded by medical equipment that instantly produced a cacophony of alarms. Every single monitoring device attached to Ben's tiny body began creating electronic mayhem. Not the desperate, erratic beeping of a medical emergency, but the bewildered, rapid-fire alerts of machines attempting to process readings that did not conform to their programmed parameters. Within moments, what felt like the entirety of the hospital staff was converging on our room. Nurses arrived first, moving with the practiced swiftness of people who have responded to thousands of alerts, followed by residents, attending physicians and specialists who would typically not be seen in the PICU wing at 4:23 in the morning. They were verifying and re-verifying Ben's vital signs, calling for additional equipment, and engaging in the kind of rapid-fire medical consultation that generally accompanies actual crises. Meanwhile, Ben sat amidst this controlled chaos, cheerfully asking if anyone remembered to give his action figure a drink, and if someone could please explain why everyone looked so concerned about a simple nap. Dr. Adams arrived looking like someone summoned to investigate a reported miracle, who isn't sure whether to be overjoyed or terrified by the implications. He conducted what could only be described as the most rigorous neurological examination in paediatric medical history, checking Ben's reflexes, cognitive responses, motor functions, and memory with the methodical precision of a person who has encountered something that doesn't fit into any medical journal he has ever studied. Ben cooperated with cheerful curiosity, asking insightful questions about each test, and whether the small flashlight Dr. Adams kept shining in his eyes was the same type that the local police used to signal headquarters. The subsequent 6 hours passed in a blur of medical procedures that would normally terrify a 3-year-old, but which Ben approached with the enthusiasm of someone participating in the world's most fascinating science experiment. CAT scans, MRIs, blood work requiring enough files to stock a small laboratory, electrical activity monitoring, and a battery of cognitive assessments designed to evaluate everything from basic motor skills to complex reasoning abilities. Ben cheerfully complied with each procedure, engaging the technicians in detailed discussions about how the devices worked, whether the loud clicking sound meant the computers were thinking very hard, and if anyone knew why hospital food tasted like disappointment mixed with well-intentioned additives. Every single test returned the same result. Completely, utterly, impossibly normal. Not just normal for a child recovering from severe head trauma, but normal in a way that implied there was never any trauma to begin with. No swelling, no indicators of injury, no suggestion whatsoever that this child had spent the better part of a week in a medically induced coma, struggling for his survival. Dr. Adams kept using terms like unprecedented bounce back and medically inexplicable, while shaking his head with the bewildered expression of someone who has just witnessed the laws of physics take an extended vacation. The nursing staff, who have collectively seen everything from genuine miracle recoveries to heartbreaking losses that defy all medical intervention, kept finding reasons to drop by our room throughout the day. They weren't checking on Ben's medical status. His numbers were better than most healthy children's. They were coming to stare at him with the fascination of people observing something that should not be possible, according to everything they have learned about human physiology and the limits of medical recovery. Ben, entirely oblivious to his status as a walking medical anomaly, spent his time constructing elaborate architectural projects out of popsicle sticks, engaging anyone willing to listen in detailed historical discussions about the relative merits of different types of castles, and asking increasingly complex questions about how hospitals function and whether the people in white coats are actually scientists or just very dedicated actors pretending to be scientists for educational television. But here is where our story takes a sharp turn into mystery hour territory, complete with baffling details that compel people to question their fundamental assumptions about how reality operates. Ben kept mentioning his conversation during his unconscious period, referring to this mysterious chat with the casual familiarity of discussing a playdate with his best friend from daycare. When we asked him who he was speaking to, expecting answers involving dreams, imagination, or the kind of complex fantasy narratives that 3-year-olds create effortlessly, he developed a thoughtful expression that seemed far too wise for someone who still requires assistance with buttoning his shirt and cutting his food into suitable pieces. The tall gentleman with the gentle eyes, Ben explained with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone sharing obviously significant information. He was really kind, and he smelled like Grandpa Leo's tool shed after it rains. You know, like sawdust and dirt and something else that makes you feel protected when you're scared. Now here is the detail that caused my scientific skepticism to start developing severe stress fractures. Ben's grandpa Leo, my father, passed away 2 years before Ben was born, meaning there is absolutely no way Ben could know about Dad's obsessive carpentry workbench or his distinctive scent combination of earth, citrus aftershave, and the particular smell of someone who spent his life coaxing beautiful things to grow in unlikely places. Chloe and I exchanged one of those charged sibling looks that carries 27 years of shared history, inside jokes, and the kind of telepathic communication that develops between people who survived the same childhood. I could see in her eyes the same chill that was currently running down my spine, like someone just walked over my grave while humming my social security number. We both knew what Ben had just described, and we both knew it was impossible for him to know it. "What did the tall gentleman tell you, darling?" Chloe asked, using the soft voice she reserved for bedtime stories, serious discussions about why we don't put building blocks in the toilet, and conversations involving potentially supernatural encounters with deceased relatives. Ben considered the question with the gravity of someone asked to recall an important business negotiation, then brightened with the enthusiasm of a child who loves having an attentive audience for his storytelling. "He told me it wasn't time to go yet, because I still have important jobs to finish," Ben announced with the certainty of someone sharing well-established facts, like showing my baby sibling how to catch fireflies and helping Mommy learn that scary dragons aren't actually scary if you understand their emotions and remember that they're mostly just big reptiles with confidence issues. The thing is, and this is where our story officially enters the Twilight Zone, Chloe is not pregnant, has never been pregnant since Ben, has not been trying to conceive, and has in fact been quite clear about being perfectly content with one child and the specific challenges that accompany raising a 3-year-old who treats every day like a geographical expedition. But Ben continued with his revelations, entirely unaware that he was currently rewriting our family's future while casually discussing supernatural career guidance. The tall gentleman also said, Aunt Sarah needs to stop worrying so much about everything making sense all the time, because some of the best parts of life are the ones that don't fit in her science books. And maybe she should spend more time looking at the clouds instead of trying to explain them away with complex terms. I felt like someone just dumped ice water down my shirt and followed it up with a lightning bolt to the brain. Because that is precisely, and I mean precisely, the kind of thing my father used to say during our Sunday afternoon strolls through the town park. Dad had this routine where he'd pick me up after lunch and we'd spend hours wandering around the neighbourhood while I bombarded him with questions about how everything worked. Why do leaves change colours? What makes clouds different shapes? How do birds know which way is south? He'd patiently answer my scientific inquiries until I had exhausted his knowledge of chemistry, biology, and physics. At which point he'd stop trying to explain and just say, "Sarah, sweetie, not everything needs to be understood to be appreciated. Sometimes the mystery is the best part." The resemblance between Ben's message and Dad's philosophy is so specific, so perfectly characteristic of my father's approach to life's inexplicable moments that for a brief, disorienting second, I could almost smell his aftershave and hear his laugh echoing through the sterile hospital air. It is the kind of detail that couldn't be a coincidence, couldn't be the product of a 3-year-old's imagination, couldn't be anything other than a direct communication from someone who knew me well enough to anticipate exactly what I would need to hear at exactly the right moment. But Ben wasn't finished with his supernatural revelations, because apparently the universe decided that completely upending my atheistic worldview wasn't quite enough excitement for one Tuesday morning. The tall gentleman also wanted me to tell you about the red folder in Grandma Agnes's sewing basket, Ben announced with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone passing along a grocery list. He said you'd understand when you found it, and that he's sorry he never got to explain about the investments before he got too sick to remember things clearly. My grandmother passed away 8 months ago after a brief, brutal struggle with Parkinson's that stripped away her memories like layers of varnish being removed from old furniture. We have been slowly, painfully going through her possessions, a process that feels like the archaeological excavation of a life lived fully and completely. But no one has touched her sewing kit yet because it felt too personal, too final, like opening those threads and handwritten notes would somehow make her death more real than all the funeral arrangements, estate lawyers, and sympathy cards combined. The red folder Ben mentions isn't something we've ever discussed with him. It's not something he could possibly know about, because we haven't even opened that sewing basket yet. It's been sitting in Chloe's spare room for 8 months, covered in one of Grandma's shawls, waiting for the day when we feel emotionally prepared to face her handwriting and remember her voice through her instructions. But somehow, this 3-year-old, who was unconscious until 5 hours ago, knows exactly what we're going to find in a container we haven't touched, and he's delivering messages from people who shouldn't be able to send them. Chloe and I spent the rest of the afternoon taking turns, holding Ben while he napped. A proper natural sleep this time, not the artificial unconsciousness of medical intervention. He looked peaceful and entirely ordinary. Just a regular kid recovering from what will likely become a story he tells at dinner parties for the rest of his life. But Chloe and I were both afraid to voice what we were thinking, afraid to acknowledge that maybe, possibly, probably, something occurred in that hospital room that doesn't fit into our carefully constructed understanding of how the world operates according to peer-reviewed scientific journals and rational thought processes. When visiting hours ended and we were finally forced to leave Ben in the capable hands of night shift nurses who had been briefed on his unusual recovery pattern, Chloe pulled out her phone and called our cousin Philip. She asked him to meet us at Grandma's house tomorrow morning, and I knew we were both thinking the same thing. We needed to find that red folder, needed to know what Ben couldn't possibly know, needed to understand how a conversation with someone who wasn't there could contain information that none of us living people possessed. The drive home that night felt different, like the world had rotated slightly on its axis, and I was seeing familiar streets through a new lens. Every scientific assumption I've held since graduate school was currently being challenged by the memory of a 3-year-old's impossible knowledge and a recovery that defied medical explanation. I kept replaying Ben's words, scrutinizing them for logical explanations, searching for rational interpretations that don't involve supernatural intervention or communication with deceased relatives. But no matter how I approached the evidence, I couldn't escape the conclusion that something occurred in that PICU room that exists outside the boundaries of everything I thought I understood about consciousness, death, and the nature of reality itself. The next morning, Chloe, David, Philip, and I gathered in Grandma's kitchen like conspirators planning a sensitive operation. Except instead of stealing something valuable, we were about to open a sewing basket that might contain proof that the impossible is actually just improbable, and that love doesn't always end when the heart stops beating. Philip, who has always been the family historian, brought his video camera because he said if we were about to discover something extraordinary, we should probably have evidence for posterity or future therapy sessions. The sewing basket sat on Grandma's kitchen table like a small wooden treasure chest, surrounded by the familiar comfort of her ceramic figurines, vintage doilies, and the lingering scent of lavender and lemon that somehow survived 8 months of emptiness. Chloe approached it with the reverence of someone handling ancient artifacts, lifting the lid with shaking hands while the rest of us held our breath and braced for either profound disappointment or life-altering revelation. The contents were organised exactly as we expected: spools of thread, fabric scraps, various needles, and a few small handwritten notes. But there, tucked between a pincushion and a pair of embroidery scissors, was a red folder that looked different from everything else in the collection. This wasn't a spool of thread or a piece of cloth. It was a formal folder, the kind used for important paperwork with "For my family" written across the front in handwriting that was shakier than Grandma's usual confident script, the uncertain letters of someone whose mind was already beginning to slip away from precise motor control. Chloe opened it with the careful attention of someone defusing a bomb, and inside we found something none of us expected: 23 bond certificates, each one tied with a red ribbon that even after all these years still carried the faint scent of sawdust and earth and citrus aftershave. The certificates were for war bonds that my grandfather had purchased during his time in the military, a fact we knew, but we had all assumed the certificates had been cashed in or lost decades ago. These bonds, carefully preserved and concealed in a sewing basket for reasons we couldn't begin to fathom, constituted a significant investment that explained mysteries we didn't even know we had. The accompanying notes mentioned Grandma's first job, a position she never spoke about, which happened 2 years before my father was born. Notes that described Grandpa's precise instructions for the patio he wanted to build when he came home, complete with detailed sketches of layout designs and notes about which materials would work best in our climate. Notes that contained the story of how he got the scar on his left hand, not from a misadventure, as we'd always been told, but from a factory injury that nearly cost him 2 fingers and made him grateful for the rest of his life, that he could still grip a wrench, still write love letters, still work on the projects that would become his retirement obsession. But the most important note, the one that made Chloe start crying and David reach for my hand, and Philip put down his camera because some moments are too sacred for documentation, was dated 3 days before Grandpa's death. It was written in the careful, deliberate handwriting of someone fighting against trembling hands and failing memory, addressed to my future grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who I may not get to meet but will always love. The note explained that he had asked Grandma to hide these old bonds in her sewing basket because he wanted us to understand that love doesn't end with death, that the connections between family members are stronger than the physical limits of human existence, and that sometimes the most vital messages are the ones that wait patiently for exactly the right moment to be delivered. He wrote about his hope that if anything ever happened to any of us, if we ever needed proof that we weren't alone in this world, we would somehow find our way to these documents and understand that love is the only force in the universe that is truly eternal. The final paragraph, written in handwriting that was barely legible, contained a message that made me question everything I thought I knew about the nature of consciousness and the possibility of communication beyond death. If something ever happens to one of my great-grandchildren, if they're ever in danger and need someone to watch over them, I want you to know that I'll be there, not because I believe in spirits or supernatural nonsense, but because love is stronger than death. And sometimes the people who leave us find ways to ensure the people they love are never truly alone. Ben made a complete recovery, not just medically complete, but the kind of total healing that makes doctors write papers for medical journals, present cases at conferences and use words like unprecedented, and requires further study in peer-reviewed publications. Dr. Adams eventually published an article about Ben's case in the Journal of Pediatric Medicine, carefully avoiding any mention of supernatural intervention, while acknowledging that current medical science cannot adequately explain the mechanism of his recovery. But the real story, the one that keeps me awake at night challenging fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality, isn't about miraculous medical recoveries or the resilience of the human brain under extreme trauma. It's about Ben's impossible knowledge, about messages delivered by someone who shouldn't have been able to deliver them, about love that transcends the apparent finality of death and finds ways to communicate across the barrier between existence and whatever comes next. Chloe discovered she was pregnant 2 months later, a surprise that shouldn't have been possible given her previous fertility struggles, but which Ben predicted with the casual certainty of someone sharing established facts. The baby is a girl, born healthy and perfect, with her grandfather's eyes and an apparent fascination with lizards that suggests she has already received some cosmic instruction in the fine art of summer entertainment. David stopped pacing and started sleeping through the night for the first time in years, though he admits he sometimes catches himself looking for tall figures with kind eyes in crowded places, just in case there are other messages waiting to be delivered through unlikely messengers. Philip started a family history project, documenting the stories contained in those old bond notes and creating a record of love that survived separation, war, time, and death itself. And me? I still don't know if I believe in a God in the traditional sense, with organised religion, formal doctrine, and specific rules about prayer and salvation. But I believe in Ben's conversation with a tall gentleman who smelled like sawdust and earth and citrus aftershave. I believe that consciousness is more complex and mysterious than anything we've discovered through scientific research. I believe that love creates connections that exist outside the boundaries of physical existence, and that sometimes the most important truths come wrapped in packages too strange for our rational minds to fully unwrap. I believe that my father, who taught me to question everything and appreciate the mystery in moments that resist explanation, found a way to deliver one final lesson through the most unlikely messenger imaginable. A 3-year-old boy who woke up from the brink of death, carrying information he shouldn't possess, messages from someone he never met, and wisdom that sounds remarkably like the voice of someone we thought we'd lost forever. Most importantly, I believe that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in my philosophy, and that sometimes the best response to the impossible is not skepticism, but gratitude for the reminder that the universe is far more mysterious, beautiful, and loving than our limited understanding can ever fully comprehend. The hardest part about truly loving a companion animal is not the loss. It's that they adore you so fully, so unconditionally, that they entrust you to make the hardest decision of your life. And somehow, through all the tears and heartbreak, you have to find the strength to do right by them one last time. The most challenging aspect of male rejection that is rarely discussed is not the refusal itself, it's the internal aftermath. 3 years later, that conversation taught me something no one tells young men. Rejection is not a judgment of your self-worth. Sometimes it's simply timing or someone else's personal struggles. The hardest part isn't being told no. It's accepting that it's permissible to feel wounded by it, and that needing time to process doesn't make you any less of a man. The moment I realised a teacher had completely crossed the professional boundary. One morning, Ms. Finch decided to publicly shame me. Right in front of the entire class, she announced, "Some students do not value their education. Perhaps you should consider dropping out." Complete silence. That afternoon, I drafted a careful email explaining my mother's chemotherapy schedule, asking if we could quietly resolve the lateness issue. Huge mistake. She forwarded my private family information to the principal, guidance counsellor, and everyone else, complete with her own comments about accountability and life lessons. The guidance counsellor, Miss Perry, had been observing the whole ordeal. She had already coordinated supports with all my other instructors weeks ago. The principal looked at Miss Finch and stated, "You were aware of her situation and still chose to humiliate her publicly." Ms. Finch was reassigned. Miss Perry became my school guardian angel, the most brutal way a family weekend ever started. My ex shows up 3 hours late, smelling strongly of cheap beer. She sees my new partner, Helen, and unleashes the full force of her anger. Before I can respond, my daughter delivers the most savage line. "Actually, Mum, She's more like an improvement. Absolute silence. My ex speeds away, and as her car peels out, my son says, "Dad, can Helen be our weekend mum forever?" That's when that brutal weekend instantly became the best thing that ever happened to us. The most creative way I ever adhered strictly to my parents' rules purely to annoy them. I showed up to dinner in full 18th century attire, a ruffled shirt borrowed from the drama club, suspenders, and a pocket watch. "What in the world are you wearing?" my father demanded. "Simply honouring your no electronics rule, sir," I replied in my most formal voice. Since modern conveniences are forbidden, I have embraced a pre-electronic lifestyle. I produced a quill pen and coffee-stained parchment. I have prepared discussion topics suitable for the Georgian era. Shall we debate the merits of whale oil as a lighting source? My mother nearly choked on her water, laughing. The final straw came when Dad's boss came for dinner, and I appeared in a medieval page outfit, announcing each course with a trumpet sound I made with my mouth. "Hear ye, hear ye! The casserole of beef has arrived!" Dad's boss was in tears of laughter as my father's face turned the exact shade of the beetroot soup. That night, Dad revised his rule to no texting during dinner and specified normal clothing required. The most embarrassing sound my body has ever made during exercise. The most horrific squeaking sound you've ever heard, like someone slowly deflating a balloon animal while simultaneously stepping on a duck. The sound was coming from my knees. My 26-year-old knees were making noises that belonged in a slasher film soundtrack. The most embarrassing thing in my ex-boyfriend's search history. Am I terrible in bed? Forum. The plot twist came with his most recent searches. How to apply for management jobs with zero experience. And do companies hire people just because they know current employees? This absolute mess of a human being had been attempting to get hired at my company. The most embarrassing thing I've done while home alone that I would die if anyone found out. I was sprawled on the kitchen floor, having a full conversation with the saved voicemail recording of my father, telling him about college and my mother's new boyfriend when I heard the front door slam. Mum stood there with grocery bags, watching me talk to a dead phone line. The look on her face was not pity, it was pure terror, like she was seeing a ghost. She could hear Dad's voice echoing from the speaker. But she didn't leave. She sat down next to me on that cold kitchen floor and started talking to the recording too. The most innocuous friendship that ruined everything. It started with late-night work texts that became more frequent. Then came the emergency calls during our date nights where she'd step away to console him about some work crisis. The breaking point came when I accidentally saw a message draft to her work friend Dan that read, "I can't stop thinking about what almost happened." Just 4 words that shattered everything. Sometimes the most dangerous friendships are the ones that start looking the most innocent. The most messed up thing my parents made me do that they called tradition. My mother had hired my fiancé, Steve, 6 months earlier to pretend to date me because she was tired of me being single at family events. She called it helping me build confidence. But really, she just couldn't handle the embarrassment of having an unmarried daughter at 28. The most mortifying autocorrect fail I've sent to the worst possible person. Autocorrect changed migraines to Ukraine. And suddenly I'd informed my ethics professor, Dr. Diaz, that I was suffering from severe Ukraines and required accommodation. Dr. Diaz replied, asking if my condition was acute or chronic and whether I'd considered treatment from the International Relations Department. That ridiculous misunderstanding earned me the only A+ I got in college. The most mundane thing I've ever had an identity crisis about. I was standing in my childhood kitchen at 2 a.m. watching my mum wash dishes in complete silence after we had just cleaned out Dad's office together, when I realised I'd been washing dishes incorrectly my entire adult life. When she finally looked up at me, tears mixing with dishwater on her cheeks, she whispered, "Your father always said you wash dishes like you're angry at them." And I understood that she wasn't just talking about dishes, the most ridiculous reason my family wanted me to dump someone. My mother demanded I dump my boyfriend Michael because he smiled too much, claiming it was evidence of psychological instability. I invited her to meet his family and watched her realise his entire bloodline was just genuinely happy people. The most ridiculous thing I've Googled at 3 a.m. How long do cancer test results take? And what does it mean when doctors delay calling back? Turns out my soft-spoken father, who hadn't raised his voice in 30 years, had been arrested for punching his doctor, the same doctor who had forgotten to call with the completely benign biopsy results. That wraps up today's Reddit story. Or should I say, stories. Thanks for hanging out with me while we journeyed through that incredible medical mystery and those bizarre family confessions. Kavemi here, signing off. Let me know in the comments what you thought about Ben's message and the incredible revelation of the red folder. And stick around for more stories with the usual Minecraft vibes in the background. I'll see you in the next one.